Welcome back to the D20 LTIC High-Level International Conference. My name is Ilaria Sotis, I'm from RAI, and I'm honored to guide this afternoon session. This morning we have learned which are the main priorities for long-term investors and the business sector to invest in infrastructure. Regulatory certainty, a global level playing field, investment-ready project pipelines and de-risking mechanism. We have also heard how technology is changing the way we need to think, design, build and maintain infrastructure. This afternoon we will focus on a key word: sustainability, the guiding star for future quality infrastructure investments. This phrase is in itself already an answer to an important question. What does the future hold? Because this is the topic we are discussing. It is not in the stars to hold our destiny, but in ourselves, as William Shakespeare suggested. And also hundreds of young people marching, even today, in the streets of the cities with the Fridays for Future. The concomitants of the pandemic with the social and economic crisis resulting from the coronavirus cannot be used as an excuse to postpone the decision to pursue this guiding star. On the contrary, it must become the driving force to do so. In the last few days, President Draghi used a parallelism with the pandemic in order to underline the urgency of the situation. Climate change is an emergency, like the pandemic. We must act immediately, he said. In the following 90 minutes, in 4 different sections with different panelists, we will tackle the theme of sustainability as the paradigm for investor in infrastructure. Therefore, let's begin with the words of Mathias Cormann, Secretary General of OECD.
Colleagues, it's my pleasure to participate in today's high-level conference and to continue supporting dialogue with infrastructure investors. I wish to thank the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti and the D20 Long-Term Investors Club for hosting this event, which builds on the successful G20 Infrastructure Investors Dialogue we both co-hosted under the umbrella of the G20 Italian presidency in June. Achieving the climate objectives of the Paris Agreement requires an unprecedented acceleration of financial flows into climate-aligned investments and a structural shift away from investments in emissions-intensive activities. At a time when massive public investment is being channeled into recovery efforts, governments can and must help leverage private finance for quality infrastructure, encouraging companies to realign their business models towards net zero emissions pathways. Achieving global net zero emissions globally will depend on the comprehensive rollout of increasingly interconnected infrastructure systems, ranging from solar power plants and offshore wind turbines to electric vehicle charging stations, electricity grids, and green hydrogen networks. The investments in infrastructure we make today will help us drive productivity gains, economic growth, more jobs, and the ability to meet our development and environmental commitments into the future. The OECD has established several instruments which can help create a more favourable environment for quality infrastructure investment and to mobilise private finance. Our recommendations on public procurement and infrastructure governance, the Anti-Bribery Convention and our guidelines for multinational enterprises can help ensure that infrastructure projects prepared by governments are well planned and managed, procured in an open and transparent manner, and consistent with best practices in terms of environmental and social objectives. We've also been very active in the G20 context with the G20 OECD high-level principles on long-term investment financing by institutional investors, or the G20 OECD guidance note on diversification of financial instruments for infrastructure and SMEs, both endorsed by G20 leaders. These standards contribute to aligning the interests of the private sector, governments and citizens, and to promote the mobilization of both public and private partnerships. The G20 OECD report on collaboration with institutional investors and asset managers on infrastructure reflected progress around this shared vision and a strong desire by investors to mainstream ESG into infrastructure financing. It also confirmed investors' view that if not managed and mitigated, these risks may ultimately impact the performance of an asset and the rate of return for investors. We must, together, actively seek ways to put these standards into practice in order to develop a pipeline of bankable and sustainable investments. By aligning our business goals with our sustainability objectives, we can help bridge the infrastructure investment gap, which is set to reach $15 trillion by 2040. To reach our climate goals under the Paris Agreement specifically, we have estimated that global investments in clean energy infrastructure will need to reach some $6.9 trillion US annually, an increase from the baseline average in 2016 of $6.3 trillion US. So let me share some considerations that could contribute to address these gaps while making our infrastructure more resilient and sustainable. First, an important part of the critical investment mass needed to narrow the infrastructure investment gap could be achieved by focusing on infrastructure maintenance, as highlighted by the G20 Italian presidency and the G20 policy agenda on infrastructure maintenance endorsed back in July. Second, to scale up infrastructure financing while fulfilling our climate and sustainability objectives, it will be crucial to work more closely with regional, subnational governments. They are responsible for 59% of public investment in G20 countries, which includes environment and climate-related public investment. By allocating funds to local authorities, we can enhance the speed of project delivery and respond more effectively to local needs. Third, we must explore ways to repurpose and green existing assets as we develop our infrastructure. For instance, by retrofitting existing buildings to make them more energy efficient. Fourth, we must go further in promoting a common understanding of ESG criteria in infrastructure, as has been highlighted in our dialogue with asset managers and institutional investors in the context of the G20. ESG labeling or certification initiatives for infrastructure could help promote, facilitate and streamline the application of international standards and best practices, while ensuring a level playing field and contributing to building trust around quality infrastructure investments. It can also help improve the environmental and social outcomes related to infrastructure investment, helping to accelerate the low-carbon transition and to address the needs of more vulnerable populations. Fifth, we need to strengthen our digital infrastructure, whose critical importance has been highlighted again in the context of the COVID crisis. In October, G20 finance ministers and central bank governors will consider important guidelines on high-quality broadband connectivity, which the OECD helped develop and which will hopefully help drive much-needed investment in this area. The OECD stands ready to continue supporting the important work of the G20 on quality infrastructure investment, in particular by engaging with the private sector. Indeed, engaging the private sector, tracking and monitoring recovery plans relevant to infrastructure and long-term infrastructure plans of G20 members, and developing input on legal and regulatory context for infrastructure investments are all areas where the OECD is very well placed to provide support and help. We look forward to strong and concrete engagement with private investors and national development banks to achieve these important international goals.
So, thanks to Mr. Cormann, and sorry, I didn't take off my mask before, I'm so used to wear it. And let's go on with the third panel. On the day, let me welcome